Section 57, Part 3, Chapter 1 continued, of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, by Vicente Blasco Ibañez, translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The very night that Julio had gone to Bordeaux, he had wandered around till sunrise, traversing half of Paris from the Lion of Belfort to the Gare de l'Est. 20,000 men, with all their campaign outfit, coming from Morocco, had disembarked at Marseilles and arrived at the capital, making part of the trip by rail and the rest afoot. They had come to take part in the great battle then beginning. They were troops composed of Europeans and Africans. The vanguard, on entering through the Orleans gate, had swung into rhythmic place, thus crossing half Paris toward the Gare de l'Est, where the trains were waiting for them. The people of Paris had seen squadrons from Tunis with theatrical uniforms, mounted on horses, nervous and fleet, Moors with yellow turbans, Senegalese with black faces and scarlet caps, colonial artillerymen, and light infantry from Africa. These were professional warriors, soldiers who in times of peace led a life of continual fighting in the colonies, men with energetic profiles, bronzed faces, and the eyes of beasts of prey. They had remained motionless in the streets for hours at a time until room could be found for them in the military trains. And Argensola had followed this armed, impassive mass of humanity from the boulevards, talking with the officials and listening to the primitive cries of the African warriors who had never seen Paris and who had passed through it without curiosity, asking where the enemy was. They had arrived in time to attack von Kluck on the banks of the Ourcq, obliging him to fall back or be completely overwhelmed. A fact which Argensola did not relate to his sympathetic guest was that his nocturnal excursion, the entire length of this division of the army, had been accompanied by the amiable damsel within and two other friends, an enthusiastic and generous coterie, distributing flowers and kisses to the swarthy soldiers and laughing at their consternation and gleaming white teeth. Another day, he had seen the most extraordinary of all the spectacles of the war. All the taxicabs, some 2,000 vehicles, conveying battalions of Zouaves, 8 men to a motor car, had gone rolling past him at full speed, bristling with guns and red caps. They had presented a most picturesque train in the boulevards, like a kind of interminable wedding procession. And these soldiers got out of the automobiles on the very edge of the battlefield, opening fire the instant that they leaped from the steps. Gallieni had launched all the men who knew how to handle a gun against the extreme right of the adversary at the supreme moment when the most insignificant weight might tip the scales in favor of the victory which was hanging in the balance. The clerks and secretaries of the military offices, the orderlies of the government, and the civil police, all had marched to give that final push, forming a mass of heterogeneous colors. And one Sunday afternoon, when with his 3 companions of the siege he was strolling with thousands of other Parisians through the Bois de Boulogne, he had learned from the extras that the combat which had developed so near to the city was turning into a great battle, a victory. I have seen much, Madame Desnoyers. I can relate great events. And she agreed with him. Of course, Argensola had seen much. And on taking her departure, she offered him all the assistance in her power. He was the friend of her son, and she was used to his petitions. Times had changed. Don Marcelo's generosity now knew no bounds. But the Bohemian interrupted her with a lordly gesture. He was living in luxury. Julio had made him his trustee. The draft from America had been honored by the bank as a deposit, and he had the use of the interest in accordance with the regulations of the moratorium. His friend was sending him regularly whatever money was needed for household expenses. Never had he been in such prosperous condition. War had its good side, too, but not wishing to break away from old customs, he announced that once more he would mount the service stairs in order to bear away a basket of bottles. After her sister's departure, Dona Luisa went alone to the churches until Chichi, in an outburst of devotional ardor, suddenly surprised her with the announcement, "Mama, I am going with you." The new devotee was no longer agitating the household by her rollicking boyish joy. She was no longer threatening the enemy with imaginary dagger thrusts. She was pale and with dark circles under her eyes. Her head was drooping as though weighed down with a set of serious, entirely new thoughts on the other side of her forehead. Dona Luisa observed her in the church with an almost indignant jealousy. Her headstrong child's eyes were moist, and she was praying as fervently as the mother, but it was surely not for her brother. Julio had passed to second place in her remembrance. Another man was now completely filling her thoughts. The last of the Lacours was no longer a simple soldier, nor was he now in Paris. Upon her return from Biarritz, Chichi had listened anxiously to the reports from her little sugar soldier. Throbbing with eagerness, she had wanted to know all about the dangers which he had been experiencing, and the young warrior in the auxiliary service told her of his restlessness in the office during the interminable days in which the troops were battling around Paris, hearing afar off the boom of the artillery. His father had wished to take him with him to Bordeaux, but the administrative confusion of the last hour had kept him in the capital. He had done something more. On the day of the great crisis, when the acting governor had sent out all the available men in automobiles, he had, unasked, seized a gun and occupied a motor with others from his office. He had not seen anything more than smoke, burning houses, and wounded men. Not a single German had passed before his eyes, excepting a band of Uhlan prisoners, but for some hours he had been shooting on the edge of the road, and nothing more. For a while that was enough for Chichi. She felt very proud to be the betrothed of a hero of the Marne, even though his intervention had lasted but a few hours. In a few days, however, her enthusiasm became rather clouded. It was becoming annoying to stroll through the streets with Rene, a simple soldier and in the auxiliary services. Besides, the women of the town, excited by the recollection of their men fighting at the front or clad in mourning because of the death of some loved one, would look at them with aggressive insolence. The refinement and elegance of the Republican prince seemed to irritate them. Several times she overheard uncomplimentary words hurled against the embusqués. The fact that her brother, who was not French, was in the thick of the fighting, made the Lacour situation still more intolerable. She had an embusqué for a lover. How her friends would laugh at her! The senator's son soon read her thoughts and began to lose some of his smiling serenity. For 3 days he did not present himself at the Desnoyers home, and they all supposed that he was detained by work at the office. One morning, as Chichi was going toward the Bois de Boulogne, escorted by one of the nut-brown maids, she noticed a soldier coming toward her. He was wearing a bright uniform of the new gray-blue, the horizon blue, just adopted by the French army. The chin strap of his kepi was gilt, and on his sleeve there was a little strip of gold. His smile, his outstretched hands, the confidence with which he advanced toward her, made her recognize him. Rene, an officer; her betrothed, a sub-lieutenant. Yes, of course, I could do nothing else. I had heard enough. Without his father's knowledge, and assisted by his friends, he had in a few days wrought this wonderful transformation. As a graduate of the École Centrale, he held the rank of a sub-lieutenant of the reserve artillery, and he had requested to be sent to the front. Goodbye to the auxiliary service. Within 2 days he was going to start for the war. "You have done this exclaimed Chichi. "You have done this!" Although very pale, she gazed fondly at him with her great eyes, eyes that seemed to devour him with admiration. "Come here, my poor boy. Come here, my sweet little soldier. I owe you something." And turning her back on the maid, she asked him to come with her around the corner. It was just the same there. The cross street was just as thronged as the avenue. But what did she care for the stare of the curious? Rapturously she flung her arms around his neck, blind and insensible to everything and everybody but him. "There! There!" And she planted on his face 2 vehement, sonorous, aggressive kisses. Then, trembling and shuddering, she suddenly weakened and, fumbling for her handkerchief, broke down in desperate weeping. End of section 57. Chapter 2 of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. Translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2 in the Studio. Upon opening the studio door one afternoon, Argensola stood motionless with surprise, as though rooted to the ground. An old gentleman was greeting him with an amiable smile. "I am the father of Julio," and he walked into the apartment with the confidence of a man entirely familiar with his surroundings. By good luck, the artist was alone and was not obliged to tear frantically from one end of the room to the other, hiding the traces of convivial company. But he was a little slow in regaining his self-control. He had heard so much about Don Marcelo and his bad temper that he was very uncomfortable at this unexpected appearance in the studio. What could the fearful man want? His tranquility was restored after a furtive, appraising glance. His friend's father had aged greatly since the beginning of the war. He no longer had that air of tenacity and ill humor that had made him unapproachable. His eyes were sparkling with childish glee, his hands were trembling slightly, and his back was bent. Argensola, who had always dodged him in the street and had thrilled with fear when sneaking up the stairway in the avenue home, now felt a sudden confidence. The transformed old man was beaming on him like a comrade and making excuses to justify his visit. He had wished to see his son's home. Poor old man, he was drawn thither by the same attraction which leads the lover to lessen his solitude by haunting the places that his beloved has frequented. The letters from Julio were not enough. He needed to see his old abode, to be on familiar terms with the objects which had surrounded him, to breathe the same air, to chat with the young man who was his boon companion. His fatherly glance now included Argensola. A very interesting fellow, that Argensola. And as he thought this, he forgot completely that without knowing him, he had been accustomed to refer to him as shameless, just because he was sharing his son's prodigal life. Desnoyers' glance roamed delightedly around the studio. He knew well these tapestries and furnishings, all the decorations of the former owner. He easily remembered everything that he had ever bought, in spite of the fact that they were so many. His eyes then sought the personal effects, everything that would call the absent occupant to mind, and he pored over the miserably executed paintings, the unfinished dabs which filled all the corners. Were they all Julio's? Many of the canvases belonged to Argensola, but affected by the old man's emotion, the artist displayed a marvelous generosity. Yes, everything was Julio's handiwork, and the father went from canvas to canvas, halting admiringly before the vaguest daubs, as though he could almost detect signs of genius in their nebulous confusion. "You think he has talent, really?" he asked in a tone that implored a favorable reply. I always thought him very intelligent, a little of the diable, perhaps, but a character changes with years. Now he is an altogether different man." And he almost wept at hearing the Spaniard, with his ready, enthusiastic speech, lauding the departed diable, graphically setting forth the way in which his great genius was going to take the world when his turn should come. The painter of souls finally worked himself up into feeling as much affected as the father, and began to admire this old Frenchman with a certain remorse, not wishing to remember how he had ranted against him not so very long ago. What injustice! Don Marcelo clasped his hand like an old comrade. All of his son's friends were his friends. He knew the life that young men lived. If at any time he should be in any difficulties, if he needed an allowance so as to keep on with his painting, there he was, anxious to help him. He then and there invited him to dine at his home that very night, and if he would care to come every evening, so much the better. He would eat a family dinner, entirely informal. War had brought about a great many changes, but he would always be as welcome to the intimacy of the hearth as though he were in his father's home. Then he spoke of Spain, in order to place himself on a more congenial footing with the artist. He had never been there but once, and then only for a short time. But after the war he was going to know it better. His father-in-law was a Spaniard, his wife had Spanish blood, and in his home the language of the family was always Castilian. Ah, Spain, the country with a noble past and illustrious men! Argensola had a strong suspicion that if he had been a native of any other land, the old gentleman would have praised it in the same way. All this affection was but a reflex of his love for his absent son. But it so pleased the impressionable fellow that he almost embraced Don Marcelo when he took his departure. After that, his visits to the studio were very frequent. The artist was obliged to recommend his friends to take a good long walk after lunch, abstaining from reappearing in the rue de la Pompe until nightfall. Sometimes, however, Don Marcelo would unexpectedly present himself in the morning, and then the soulful impressionist would have to scurry from place to place, hiding here, concealing there, in order that his workroom should preserve its appearance of virtuous labor. "Youth, youth," the visitor would murmur with a smile of tolerance, and he actually had to make an effort to recall the dignity of his years in order not to ask Argensola to present him to the fair fugitives whose presence he suspected in the interior rooms. Perhaps they had been his boy's friends, too. They represented a part of his past anyway, and that was enough to make him presume that they had great charms which made them interesting. These surprises, with their upsetting consequences, finally made the painter rather regret his new friendship, and the invitations to dinner which he was constantly receiving bored him, too. He found the Desnoyers table most excellent, but too tedious, for the father and mother could talk of nothing but their absent son. Chichi scarcely looked at her brother's friend. Her attention was entirely concentrated on the war. The irregularity in the mails was exasperating her, so that she began composing protests to the government whenever a few days passed by without bringing any letter from Sub Lieutenant Lacour. Argensola excused himself on various pretexts from continuing to dine in the avenue Victor Hugo. It pleased him far more to haunt the cheap restaurants with his female flock. His host accepted his negatives with good-natured resignation. Not today either? And in order to compensate for his guest's non-appearance, he would present himself at the studio earlier than ever on the day following. It was an exquisite pleasure for the doting father to let the time slip by seated on the divan which still seemed to guard the very hollow made by Julio's body, gazing at the canvases covered with color by his brush, toasting his toes by the beat of a stove which roared so cozily in the profound conventual silence. It certainly was an agreeable refuge, full of memories in the midst of monotonous Paris, so saddened by the war that he could not meet a friend who was not preoccupied with his own troubles. His former purchasing dissipations had now lost all charm for him. The Hotel Drouot no longer tempted him. At that time the goods of German residents, seized by the government, were being auctioned off, a felicitous retaliation for the enforced journey which the fittings of the castle of Villeblanche had taken on the road to Berlin. But the agents told him in vain of the few competitors which he would now meet. He no longer felt attracted by these extraordinary bargains. Why buy anything more? Of what use was such useless stuff? Whenever he thought of the hard life of millions of men in the open field, he felt a longing to lead an ascetic life. He was beginning to hate the ostentatious splendors of his home on the avenue Victor Hugo. He now recalled without a regretful pang the destruction of the castle. No, he was far better off there, and there was always the studio of Julio. Argensola began to form the habit of working in the presence of Don Marcelo. He knew that the resolute soul abominated inactive people, so under the contagious influence of dominant willpower, he began several new pieces. Desnoyers would follow with interest the motions of his brush and accept all the explanations of the soulful delineator. For himself, he always preferred the old masters, and in his bargains had acquired the work of many a dead artist. But the fact that Julio had thought as his partner did was now enough for the devotee of the antique, and made him admit humbly all the Spaniard's superior theories. The artist's laborious zeal was always of short duration. After a few moments, he always found that he preferred to rest on the divan and converse with his guest. The first subject, of course, was the absentee. They would repeat fragments of the letters they had received, and would speak of the past with the most discreet allusions. The painter described Julio's life before the war as an existence dedicated completely to art. The father ignored the inexactitude of such words and gratefully accepted the lie as a proof of friendship. Argensola was a clever comrade, never in his loftiest verbal flights making the slightest reference to Madame Laurier. The old gentleman was often thinking about her nowadays, for he had seen her in the street giving her arm to her husband, now recovered from his wounds. The illustrious Lacour had informed him with great satisfaction of their reconciliation. The engineer had lost but one eye. Now he was again at the head of his factory, requisitioned by the government for the manufacture of shells. He was a captain and was wearing 2 decorations of honor. The senator did not know exactly how this unexpected agreement had come about. He had one day seen them coming home together, looking affectionately at each other, in complete oblivion of the past. "Who remembers things that happened before the war?" said the politic sage. "They and their friends have completely forgotten all about their divorce. Nowadays we are all living a new existence. I believe that the two are happier than ever before." Desnoyers had had a presentiment of this happiness when he saw them together, and the man of inflexible morality, who was the year before anathematizing his son's behavior toward Laurier, considering it the most unpardonable of his adventures, now felt a certain indignation in seeing Marguerite devoted to her husband and talking to him with such affectionate interest. This matrimonial felicity seemed to him like the basest ingratitude. A woman who had had such an influence over the life of Julio, could she thus easily forget her love? The two had passed on as though they did not recognize him. Perhaps Captain Laurier did not see him very clearly, but she had looked at him frankly and then hastily averted her eyes so as to evade his greeting. The old man felt sad over such indifference, not on his own account, but on his son's. Poor Julio! The unbending parent, in complete mental immorality, found himself lamenting this indifference as something monstrous. End of section 58. Part 3, Chapter 2 continued, of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez, translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The war was the other topic of conversation during the afternoons passed in the studio. Argensola was not now stuffing his pockets with printed sheets as at the beginning of hostilities. A serene and resigned calm had succeeded the excitement of those first moments when the people were daily looking for miraculous interventions. All the periodicals were saying about the same thing. He was content with the official report, and he had learned to wait for that document without impatience, foreseeing that, with but few exceptions, it would say the same thing as the day before. The fever of the first months, with its illusions and optimisms, now appeared to Argensola somewhat chimerical. Those not actually engaged in the war were returning gradually to their habitual occupations. Life had recovered its regular rhythm. One must live, said the people, and the struggle for existence filled their thoughts with its immediate urgency. Those whose relatives were in the army were still thinking of them, but their occupations were so blunting the edge of memory that they were becoming accustomed to their absence, regarding the unusual as the normal condition. At first the war made sleep out of the question, food impossible to swallow, and embittered every pleasure with its funereal pall. Now the shops were slowly opening, money was in circulation, and people were able to laugh. They talked of the great calamity, but only at certain hours, as something that was going to be long, very long, and would exact great resignation to its inevitable fatalism. Humanity accustoms itself easily to trouble, said Argensola, provided that the trouble lasts long enough. In this lies our strength. Don Marcelo was not in sympathy with the general resignation. The war was going to be much shorter than they were all imagining. His enthusiasm had settled on a speedy termination within the next 3 months, the next spring probably. If peace were not declared in the spring, it surely would be in the summer. A new talker took part in these conversations. Desnoyers had become acquainted with the Russian neighbor of whom Argensola had so frequently spoken. Since this odd personage had also known his son, that was enough to make Tchernoff arouse his interest. In normal times he would have kept him at a distance. The millionaire was a great believer in law and order. He abominated revolutionists with the instinctive fear of all the rich who have built up a fortune and remember their humble beginnings. Tchernoff's socialism and nationality brought vividly to his mind a series of feverish images: bombs, daggers, stabbings, deserved expiations on the gallows, and exile to Siberia. No, he was not desirable as a friend. But now Don Marcelo was experiencing an abrupt reversal of his convictions regarding alien ideas. He had seen so much. The revolting proceedings of the invasion, the unscrupulous methods of the German chiefs, the tranquility with which their submarines were sinking boats filled with defenseless passengers, the deeds of the aviators who were hurling bombs upon unguarded cities, destroying women and children, all this was causing the events of revolutionary terrorism which years ago used to arouse his wrath to sink into relative unimportance. "And to think," he said, "that we used to be as infuriated as though the world were coming to an end just because someone threw a bomb at a grandee." Those titled victims had had certain reprehensible qualities which had justified their execution. They had died in consequence of acts which they undertook, knowing well what the punishment would be. They had brought retribution on themselves without trying to evade it, rarely taking any precautions, while the terrorists of this war, with the violence of his imperious character, the old conservative now swung to the opposite extreme. "The true anarchists are yet on top," he he said with an ironical laugh. "Those who terrified us formerly, all put together, were but a few miserable creatures. In a few seconds, these of our day kill more innocent people than those others did in 30 years." The gentleness of Tchernoff, his original ideas, his incoherencies of thought, bounding from reflection to word without any preparation, finally won Don Marcelo so completely over that he formed the habit of consulting him about all his doubts. His admiration made him, too, overlook the source of certain bottles with which Argensola sometimes treated his neighbor. He was delighted to have Tchernoff consume these souvenirs of the time when he was living at sword's point with his son. After sampling the wine from the Avenue Victor Hugo, the Russian would indulge in a visionary loquacity similar to that of the night when he evoked the fantastic cavalcade of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. What his new convert most admired was his facility for making things clear and fixing them in the imagination. The battle of the Marne, with its subsequent combats, and the course of both armies, were events easily explained. If the French only had not been so fatigued after their triumph of the Marne. "But human powers," continued Tchernoff, "have their limits, and the French soldier, with all his enthusiasm, is a man like the rest. In the first place, the most rapid of marches from the east to the north, in order to resist the invasion of Belgium; then the combats; then the swift retreat, that they might not be surrounded; finally, a 7 days' battle. And all this in a period of 3 weeks, no more. In their moment of triumph, the victors lacked the legs to follow up their advantage, and they lacked the cavalry to pursue the fugitives. Their beasts were even more exhausted than the men. When those who were retreating found that they were being spurred on with lessening tenacity, they had stretched themselves half dead with fatigue on the field, excavating the ground and forming a refuge for themselves. The French also flung themselves down, scraping the soil together so as not to lose what they had gained. And in this way began the war of the trenches. Then each line, with the intention of wrapping itself around that of the enemy, had gone on prolonging itself toward the northeast, and from these successive stretchings had resulted the double course toward the sea, forming the greatest battle front ever known to history. When Don Marcelo, with optimistic enthusiasm, announced the end of the war in the following spring or summer, in 4 months at the outside, the Russian shook his head. "It will be long, very long. It is a new war, the genuine modern warfare. The Germans began hostilities in the old way, as though they had observed nothing since 1870. A war of involved movements, of battles in the open field, the same as Moltke might have planned, imitating Napoleon. They were desirous of bringing it to a speedy conclusion, and were sure of triumph. Why employ new methods? But the encounter of the Marne twisted their plans, making them shift from the aggressive to the defensive. They then brought into service all that the war staff had learned in the campaigns of the Japanese and Russians, beginning the war of the trenches, the subterranean struggle which is the logical outcome of the reach and number of shots of the modern armament. The conquest of half a mile of territory today stands for more than did the assault of a stone fortress a century ago. Neither side is going to make any headway for a long time. Perhaps they may never make a definite advance. The war is bound to be long and tedious, like the athletic conquests between opponents who are equally matched." "But it will have to come to an end sometime," interpolated Desnoyers. "Undoubtedly, but who knows when? And in what condition will they both be when it is all over?" End of section 59. Part 3, Chapter 2, continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez. Translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He was counting upon a rapid finale when it was least expected, through the exhaustion of one of the contestants, carefully dissimulated until the last moment. "Germany will be vanquished," he added with firm conviction. "I do not know when nor how, but she will fall logically. She failed in her master stroke in not entering Paris and overcoming its opposition. All the trumps in her pack of cards were then played. She did not win, but continues playing the game because she holds many cards, and she will prolong it for a long time to come. But what she could not do at first, she will never be able to do." For Tchernoff, the final defeat did not mean the destruction of Germany, nor the annihilation of the German people. "Excessive patriotism irritates me," he pursued. "Hearing people form plans for the definite extinction of Germany seems to me like listening to the pan-Germanists of Berlin when they talk of dividing up the continents." Then he summed up his opinion. "Imperialism will have to be crushed for the sake of the tranquility of the world. The great war machine which menaces the peace of nations will have to be suppressed. Since 1870 we have all been living in dread of it. For 40 years the war has been averted, but in all that time, what apprehension! What was most irritating Tchernoff was the moral lesson born of this situation which had ended by overwhelming the world. The glorification of power, the sanctification of success, the triumph of materialism, the respect for the accomplished fact, the mockery of the noblest sentiments as though they were merely sonorous and absurd phrases, the reversal of moral values, a philosophy of bandits which pretended to be the last word of progress and was no more than a return to despotism, violence, and the barbarity of the most primitive epochs of history. While he was longing for the suppression of the representatives of this tendency, he would not therefore demand the extermination of the German people. This nation has great merits, jumbled with bad conditions inherited from a not far distant barbarous past. It possesses the genius of organization and work, and is able to lend great service to humanity. But first it is necessary to give it a douche, the douche of downfall. The Germans are mad with pride, and their madness threatens the security of the world. When those who have poisoned them with the illusion of universal hegemony have disappeared, when misfortune has freshened their imaginations and transformed them into a community of humans, neither superior nor inferior to the rest of mankind, they will become a tolerant people, useful, and who knows but they may even prove sympathetic. According to Tchernoff, there was not in existence today a more dangerous nation. Its political organization was converting it into a warrior horde, educated by kicks and submitted to continual humiliations in order that the willpower, which always resists discipline, might be completely nullified. It is a nation where all receive blows and desire to give them to those lower down. The kick that the Kaiser gives is transmitted from back to back down to the lowest rung in the social ladder. The blows began in the school and are continued in the barracks, forming part of the education. The apprenticeship of the Prussian crown princes has always consisted in receiving fisticuffs and cowhidings from their progenitor, the king. The Kaiser beats his children, the officer his soldiers, the father his wife and children, the schoolmaster his pupils, and when the superior is not able to give blows, he subjects those under him to the torment of moral insult. On this account, when they abandoned their ordinary avocations, taking up arms in order to fall upon another human group, they did so with implacable ferocity. "Each one of them," continued the Russian, "carries on his back the marks of kicks, and when his turn comes, he seeks consolation in passing them on to the unhappy creatures whom war puts into his power. This nation of warlords, as they love to call themselves, aspires to lordship, but outside of the country. Within it are the ones who least appreciate human dignity and therefore long vehemently to spread their dominant will over the face of the earth, passing from lackeys to lords." Suddenly, Don Marcelo stopped going with such frequency to the studio. He was now haunting the home and office of the senator because this friend had upset his tranquility. Lacour had been much depressed since the heir of the family glory had broken through the protecting paternal net in order to go to war. One night, while dining with the Desnoyers family, an idea popped into his head which filled him with delight. "Would you like to see your son?" He needed to see Rene, and had been negotiating for a permit from headquarters which would allow him to visit the front. His son belonged to the same army division as Julio. Perhaps their camps were rather far apart, but an automobile makes many revolutions before it reaches the end of its journey. It was not necessary to say more. Desnoyers instantly felt the most overmastering desire to see his boy, since for so many months he had had to content himself with reading his letters and studying the snapshot which one of his comrades had made of his soldier son. From that time on, he besieged the senator as though he were a political supporter desiring an office. He visited him in the mornings in his home, invited him to dinner every evening, and hunted him down in the salons of the Luxembourg. Before the first word of greeting could be exchanged, his eyes were formulating the same interrogation: "When will you get that permit?" The great man could only reply by lamenting the indifference of the military department toward the civilian element. It always had been inimical toward parliamentarism. Besides, Joffre is showing himself most unapproachable. He does not encourage the curious. Tomorrow I will see the president. A few days later he arrived at the house of the avenue Victor Hugo with an expression of radiant satisfaction that filled Don Marcelo with joy. "It has come? It has come. We start the day after tomorrow." Desnoyers went the following afternoon to the studio in the rue de la Pompe. "I am going tomorrow." The artist was very eager to accompany him. Would it not be possible for him to go too, as secretary to the senator? Don Marcelo smiled benevolently. The authorization was only for Lacour and one companion. He was the one who was going to pose as secretary, valet or utility man to his future relative-in-law. At the end of the afternoon he left the studio, accompanied to the elevator by the lamentations of Argensola. To think that he could not join that expedition! He believed that he had lost the opportunity to paint his masterpiece. Just outside of his home he met Tchernoff. Don Marcelo was in high good humor. The certainty that he was going to see his son filled him with boyish good spirits. He almost embraced the Russian in spite of his slovenly aspect, his tragic beard and his enormous hat, which made everyone turn to look after him. At the end of the avenue, the Arc de Triomphe stood forth against a sky crimsoned by the sunset. A red cloud was floating around the monument, reflected on its whiteness with purpling palpitations. Desnoyers recalled the Four Horsemen and all that Argensola had told him before presenting him to the Russian. "Blood!" he shouted jubilantly. "All the sky seems to be blood red. It is the apocalyptic beast who has received his death wound. Soon we shall see him die." Tchernoff smiled too, but his was a melancholy smile. "No, the beast does not die. It is the eternal companion of man. It hides spouting blood 40, 60, 100 years, but eventually it reappears. All that we can hope is that its wound may be long and deep, that it may remain hidden so long that the generation that now remembers it may never see it again. End of section 60. Part 3, Chapter 3 of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, by Vicente Blasco Ibañez, translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, War. Don Marcelo was climbing up a mountain covered with woods. The forest presented a tragic desolation. A silent tempest had installed itself therein, placing everything in violent, unnatural positions. Not a single tree still preserved its upright form and abundant foliage as in the days of peace. The groups of pines recalled the columns of ruined temples. Some were still standing erect, but without their crowns, like shafts that might have lost their capitals. Others were pierced like the mouthpiece of a flute, or like pillars struck by a thunderbolt. Some had splintery threads hanging around their cuts like used toothpicks. A sinister force of destruction had been raging among these beeches, spruce and oaks. Great tangles of their cut boughs were cluttering the ground, as though a band of gigantic woodcutters had just passed by. The trunks had been severed a little distance from the ground with a clean and glistening stroke, as though with a single blow of the axe. Around the disinterred roots were quantities of stones mixed with sod, stones that had been sleeping in the recesses of the earth and had been brought to the surface by explosions. At intervals, gleaming among the trees or blocking the roadway with an importunity which required some zigzagging, was a series of pools all alike of regular geometrical circles. To Desnoyers they seemed like sunken basins for the use of invisible titans who had been hewing the forest. Their great depth extended to their very edges. A swimmer might dive into these lagoons without ever touching bottom. Their water was greenish, still water, rainwater with a scum of vegetation perforated by the respiratory bubbles of the little organisms coming to life in its vitals. Bordering the hilly pathway through the pines were many mounds with crosses of wood, tombs of French soldiers topped with little tricolored flags. Upon these moss-covered graves were the old kepis of the gunners. The ferocious wood chopper, in destroying this woods, had also blindly demolished many of the ants swarming around the trunks. Don Marcelo was wearing leggings, a broad hat, and on his shoulders a fine poncho arranged like a shawl, garments which recalled his far distant life on the ranch. Behind him came Lacour, trying to preserve his senatorial dignity in spite of his gasps and puffs of fatigue. He also was wearing high boots and a soft hat, but he had kept to his solemn frock coat in order not to abandon entirely his parliamentary uniform. Before them marched two captains as guides. They were on a mountain occupied by the French artillery and were climbing to the top where were hidden cannons, and cannons forming a line some miles in length. The German artillery had caused the woodland ruin around the visitors in their return of the French fire. The circular pools were the hollows dug by the German shells in the limy, non-porous soil which preserved all the runnels of rain. The visiting party had left their automobile at the foot of the mountain. One of the officers, a former artilleryman, explained this precaution to them. It was necessary to climb this roadway very cautiously. They were within reach of the enemy, and an automobile might attract the attention of their gunners. "A little fatiguing this climb," he continued. "Courage, Senator Lacour, we are almost there." They began to meet artillerymen. Many of them were not in uniform, but wearing the military kepis. They looked like workmen from a metal factory, foundrymen with jackets and pantaloons of corduroy. Their arms were bare, and some had put on wooden shoes in order to get over the mud with greater security. They were former iron laborers mobilized into the artillery reserves. Their sergeants had been factory overseers, and many of them officials, engineers and proprietors of big workshops. Suddenly the excursionists stumbled upon the iron inmates of the woods. When these spoke, the earth trembled, the air shuddered, and the native inhabitants of the forest, the crows, rabbits, butterflies and ants, fled in terrified flight, trying to hide themselves from the fearful convulsion which seemed to be bringing the world to an end. Just at present, the bellowing monsters were silent, so that they came upon them unexpectedly. Something was sticking up out of the greenery like a gray beam. At other times, this apparition would emerge from a conglomeration of dry trunks. Around this obstacle was cleared ground occupied by men who lived, slept and worked about this huge manufactory on wheels. The senator, who had written verse in his youth and composed oratorical poetry when dedicating various monuments in his district, saw in these solitary men on the mountainside, blackened by the sun and smoke, with naked breasts and bare arms, a species of priests dedicated to the service of a fatal divinity that was receiving from their hands offerings of enormous explosive capsules, hurling them forth in thunderclaps. Hidden under the branches, in order to escape the observation of the enemy's birdmen, the French cannon were scattered among the hills and hollows of the highland range. In this herd of steel there were enormous pieces with wheels reinforced by metal plates, somewhat like the farming engines which Desnoyers had used on his ranch for plowing. Like smaller beasts, more agile and playful in their incessant yelping, the groups of 75 were mingled with the terrific monsters. The two captains had received from the general of their division orders to show Senator Lacour minutely the workings of the artillery, and Lacour was accepting their observations with corresponding gravity, while his eyes roved from side to side in the hope of recognizing his son. The interesting thing for him was to see Rene, but recollecting the official pretext of his journey, he followed submissively from cannon to cannon, listening patiently to all explanations. The operators next showed him the servants of these pieces, great oval cylinders extracted from subterranean storehouses called shelters. These storage places were deep burrows, oblique wells reinforced with sacks of stone and wood. They served as a refuge to those off duty and kept the munitions away from the enemy's shell. An artilleryman exhibited 2 pouches of white cloth, joined together and very full. They looked like a double sausage and were the charge for one of the large cannons. The open packet showed some rose-colored leaves, and the senator greatly admired this dainty paste, which looked like an article for the dressing table instead of one of the most terrible explosives of modern warfare. "I am sure," said Lacour, "that if I found one of these delicate packets on the street, I should have thought that it had been dropped from some lady's vanity bag, or by some careless clerk from a perfumery shop. Anything but an explosive. And with this trifle that looks as if it were made for the lips, it is possible to blow up an edifice." End of section 61. 62, Part 3, Chapter 3 continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez, translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As they continued their visit of investigation, they came upon a partially destroyed round tower in the highest part of the mountain. This was the most dangerous post. From it an officer was examining the enemy's line in order to gauge the correctness of the aim of the gunners. While his comrades were under the ground or hidden by the branches, he was fulfilling his mission from this visible point. A short distance from the tower, a subterranean passageway opened before their eyes. They descended through its murky recesses until they found the various rooms excavated in the ground. One side of the mountain, cut in points, formed its exterior facade. Narrow little windows cut in the stone gave light and air to these quarters. An old commandant in charge of the section came out to meet them. Desnoyers thought that he must be the floor walker of some big department store in Paris. His manners were so exquisite and his voice so suave that he seemed to be imploring pardon at every word, or addressing a group of ladies, offering them goods of the latest novelty. But this impression only lasted a moment. This soldier with gray hair and near-sighted glasses, who in the midst of war was retaining his customary manner of a building director receiving his clients, showed on moving his arms some bandages and surgical dressings within his sleeves. He was wounded in both wrists by the explosion of a shell, but he was nevertheless sticking to his post. "A devil of a honey-tongued, syrupy gentleman," mused Don Marcelo, "yet he is undoubtedly an exceptional person." By this time they had entered into the main office, a vast room which received its light through a horizontal window about 10 feet wide and only a palm and a half high, reminding one of the open space between the slats of a Venetian blind. Below it was a pine table filled with papers and surrounded by stools. When occupying one of these seats, one's eyes could sweep the entire plain. On the walls were electric apparatus, acoustic tubes and telephones, many telephones. The Commandant sorted and piled up the papers, offering the stools with drawing room punctilio. "Here, Senator Lacour." Desnoyers, humble attendant, took a seat at his side. The Commandant now appeared to be the manager of a theater preparing to exhibit an extraordinary show. He spread upon the table an enormous paper which reproduced all the features of the plain extended before them: roads, towns, fields, heights and valleys. Upon this map was a triangular group of red lines in the form of an open fan. The vertex represented the place where they were, and the broad part of the triangle was the limit of the horizon which they were sweeping with their eyes. "We are going to fire at that grove," said the artilleryman, pointing to one end of the map. "There it is," he continued, designating a little dark line. "Take your glasses." But before they could adjust the binoculars, the Commandant placed a new paper on top of the map. It was an enormous and somewhat hazy photograph upon whose plan appeared a fan of red lines like the other one. "Our aviators," explained the gunner courteously, "have taken this morning some views of the enemy's positions. This is an enlargement from our photographic laboratory. According to this information, there are 2 German regiments encamped in that wood." Don Marcelo saw on the print the spot of woods, and within it white lines which represented roads, and groups of little squares which were blocks of houses in a village. He believed that he must be in an aeroplane contemplating the earth from a height of 3,000 feet. Then he raised the glasses to his eyes, following the direction of one of the red lines, and saw enlarged in the circle of the glass a black bar, somewhat like a heavy line of ink. The grove, the refuge of the foe. "Whenever you say, Senator Lacour, we will begin," said the Commandant, reaching the topmost notch of his courtesy. "Are you ready?" Desnoyers smiled slightly. For what was his illustrious friend to make himself ready? What difference could it possibly make to a mere spectator, much interested in the novelty of the show? There sounded behind them numberless bells, gongs that called and gongs that answered. The acoustic tubes seemed to swell out with the gallop of words. The electric wire filled the silence of the room with the palpitations of its mysterious life. The bland chief was no longer occupied with his guests. They conjectured that he was behind them, his mouth at the telephone, conversing with various officials some distance off. Yet the urbane and well-spoken hero was not abandoning for one moment his candid courtesy. "Will you be kind enough to tell me when you are ready to begin?" they heard him saying to a distant officer. "I shall be much pleased to transmit the order." Don Marcelo felt a slight nervous tremor near one of his legs. It was Lacour on the qui vive over the approaching novelty. They were going to begin firing. Something was going to happen that he had never seen before. The cannons were above their heads. The roughly vaulted roof was going to tremble like the deck of a ship when they shot over it. The room with its acoustic tubes and its vibrations from the telephones was like the bridge of a vessel at the moment of clearing for action. The noise that it was going to make! A few seconds flitted by that to them seemed unusually long, and then suddenly a sound like a distant peal of thunder which appeared to come from the clouds. Desnoyers no longer felt the nervous twitter against his knee. The senator seemed surprised. His expression seemed to say, "And is that all?" The heaps of earth above them had deadened the report, so that the discharge of the great machine seemed no more than the blow of a club upon a mattress. Far more impressive was the scream of the projectile, sounding at a great height, but displacing the air with such violence that its waves reached even to the window. It went flying, flying, its roar lessening. Some time passed before they noticed its effects, and the two friends began to believe that it must have been lost in space. "It will not strike, it will not strike," they were thinking. Suddenly there surged up on the horizon, exactly in the spot indicated over the blur of the woods, a tremendous column of smoke, a whirling tower of black vapor, followed by a volcanic explosion. "How dreadful it must be to be there," said the senator. He and Desnoyers were experiencing a sensation of animal joy, a selfish hilarity in seeing themselves in such a safe place several yards underground. End of section 62. Part 3, Chapter 3 continued, of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse by Vicente Blasco Ibañez, translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "The Germans are going to reply at any moment," said Don Marcelo to his friend. The senator was of the same opinion. Undoubtedly they would retaliate, carrying on an artillery duel. All of the French batteries had opened fire. The mountain was thundering, the shell whining, the horizon, still tranquil, was bristling with black spiral columns. The two realized more and more how snug they were in this retreat, like a box at the theater. Someone touched Lacour on the shoulder. It was one of the captains who was conducting them through the front. "We are going above," he said simply. "You must see close by how our cannons are working. The sight will be well worth the trouble." "Above?" The illustrious man was as perplexed, as astonished as though he had suggested an interplanetary trip. Above, when the enemy was going to reply from one minute to another? The captain explained that Sub Lieutenant Lacour was perhaps awaiting his father. By telephone they had advised his battery, stationed a little further on. It would be necessary to go now in order to see him. So they again climbed up to the light through the mouth of the tunnel. The senator then drew himself up majestically erect. "They are going to fire at us," said a voice in his interior. "The foe is going to reply." But he adjusted his coat like a tragic mantle and advanced at a circumspect and solemn pace. If those military men, adversaries of parliamentarism, fancied that they were going to laugh up their sleeve at the timidity of a civilian, he would show them their mistake. Desnoyers could not but admire the resolution with which the great man made his exit from the shelter, exactly as if he were going to march against the foe. At a little distance, the atmosphere was rent into tumultuous waves, making their legs tremble, their ears hum, and their necks feel as though they had just been struck. They both thought that the Germans had begun to return the fire, but it was the French who were shooting. A feathery stream of vapor came up out of the woods a dozen yards away, dissolving instantly. One of the largest pieces, hidden in a nearby thicket, had just been discharged. The captains continued their explanations without stopping their journey. It was necessary to pass directly in front of the spitting monster, in spite of the violence of its reports, so as not to venture out into the open woods near the watchtower. They were expecting from one second to another now the response from their neighbors across the way. The guide accompanying Don Marcelo congratulated him on the fearlessness with which he was enduring the cannonading. "My friend is well acquainted with it," remarked the senator proudly. "He was in the Battle of the Marne." The two soldiers evidently thought this very strange, considering Desnoyers' advanced age. To what section had he belonged? In what capacity had he served? "Merely as a victim," was the modest reply. An officer came running toward them from the tower side, across the cleared space. He waved his kepi several times that they might see him better. Lacour trembled for him. The enemy might descry him. He was simply making a target of himself by cutting across that open space in order to reach them the sooner, and he trembled still more as he came nearer. It was Rene. His hands returned with some astonishment the strong muscular grasp. He noticed that the outlines of his son's face were more pronounced and darkened with the tan of camp life. An air of resolution, of confidence in his own powers, appeared to emanate from his person. 6 months of intense life had transformed him. He was the same, but broader chested and more stalwart. The gentle and sweet features of his mother were lost under the virile mask. Lacour recognized with pride that he now resembled himself. After greetings had been exchanged, Rene paid more attention to Don Marcelo than to his father, because he reminded him of Chichi. He inquired after her, wishing to know all the details of her life, in spite of their ardent and constant correspondence. The senator, meanwhile, still under the influence of his recent emotion, had adopted a somewhat oratorical air toward his son. He forthwith improvised a fragment of discourse in honor of that soldier of the Republic, bearing the glorious name of Lacour, deeming this an opportune time to make known to these professional soldiers the lofty lineage of his family. "Do your duty, my son. The Lacours inherit warrior traditions. Remember our ancestor, the deputy of the Convention, who covered himself with glory in the defense of Mayence." While he was discoursing, they had started forward, doubling a point of the greenwood in order to get behind the cannons. Here the racket was less violent. The great engines, after each discharge, were letting escape through the rear chambers little clouds of smoke like those from a pipe. The sergeants were dictating numbers, communicated in a low voice by another gunner who had a telephone receiver at his ear. The workmen around the cannon were obeying silently. They would touch a little wheel and the monster would raise its gray snout, moving it from side to side with the intelligent expression and agility of an elephant's trunk. At the foot of the nearest piece stood the operator, rod in hand and with impassive face. He must be deaf, yet his facial inertia was stamped with a certain authority. For him, life was no more than a series of shots and detonations. He knew his importance. He was the servant of the tempest, the guardian of the thunderbolt. "Fire!" shouted the sergeant, and the thunder broke forth in fury. Everything appeared to be trembling, but the two visitors were by this time so accustomed to the din that the present uproar seemed but a secondary affair. Lacour was about to take up the thread of his discourse about his glorious forefather in the Convention when something interfered. "They are firing," said the man at the telephone simply. The two officers repeated to the senator this news from the watchtower. Had he not said that the enemy was going to fire? Obeying a sane instinct of preservation, and pushed at the same time by his son, he found himself in the refuge of the battery. He certainly did not wish to hide himself in this cave, so he remained near the entrance, with a curiosity which got the best of his disquietude. He felt the approach of the invisible projectile in spite of the roar of the neighboring cannon. He perceived with rare sensibility its passage through the air, above the other closer and more powerful sounds. It was a squealing howl that was swelling in intensity, that was opening out as it advanced, filling all space. Soon it ceased to be a shriek, became a rude roar formed by diverse collisions and frictions, like the descent of an electric tram through a hillside road, or the course of a train which passes through a station without stopping. Section 64